Kind of working our way from my right at the end of the table, we have Teresa Younger. Teresa has served as president and CEO of the Mrs. Foundation for Women.
Ms.
Ms. Oh, you're right. My mistake. Thank you. Had to get the first mistake out. Now I feel better.
It's okay.
Thanks, Teresa. So she's been serving as the CEO of the Ms. Foundation for Women, the oldest women's foundation in the United States. She's been serving since 2014. Under her leadership, the foundation launched the hashtag MyFeminismIs, a multimedia campaign sparking a national conversation on feminism, funded a groundbreaking report on the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, joined leading women's foundations at the White House to announce a $100 million funding commitment.
Under a different administration.
Yes. To create pathways to economic opportunity for low-income women and girls, and led a campaign to hold the NFL accountable for violence against women. A noted speaker, advocate, and activist, Younger has been on the front lines of some of the most important battles for women's health, safety, and economic justice. She was honored by the Planned Parenthood Federation of America as a Dream Keeper, given the Liberty Bank Willard M. McRae Community Diversity Award, and named one of the 50 most powerful women in the philanthropy by Inside Philanthropy. Tulio K. Cardozo. In January of 2017, Tulio joined the Last Mile as IT manager. Well, I guess earlier than that, new title, IT manager, of TLM Works. He is an experienced website developer and with deep skills in cloud infrastructure, web security, and creating technology-based solutions that drive organizational goals and objectives. Cardozo leads the first team of incarcerated web developers working through a joint venture between the California Prison Industry Authority and the Last Mile. Under his leadership, developers in the program gain work experience building websites for real customers. Notably, Cardozo is the first credentialed employee authorized to work in the facility where he was once incarcerated. Through this personal experience as an inmate, a founding graduate of the Last Mile, and his post-release technology career, he helps guide the developers in the TLM Works program through their first technical work experience and into successful technology careers. Chris Borland, a former athlete. Chris Borland was an All-American and Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year while at the University of Wisconsin. He was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers in the third round of the 2014 NFL Draft, led the team in tackles as a rookie, and was named to the All-Rookie team and to the Pro Bowl as an alternate. He retired from the NFL in 2015 over concerns about brain injury. He has worked in mental health and the Carter Center in concussion awareness advocacy with the Concussion Legacy Foundation and Gridiron Greats, and has consulted on films such as Concussion and Requiem for a Running Back. In 2017, Borland led the first study in meditation with former NFL players at the Center for Healthy Minds. Today, Borland is a meditation teacher at Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. Borland has been featured on The Face of the Nation, CBS This Morning, ESPN, Outside the Lines, and the Huffington Post, among others. Priya Jha. Priya is a professor and chair of English at the University of Redlands, where she has taught in the department, but also in women, gender, and sexuality studies, race and ethnic studies, and media and visual cultures for the past 13 years. Driven partly by her own biography as an immigrant from India, she explores in her work the lives of people whose histories lie in colonialism and the various ways in which their needs, desires, and hopes intersect. Currently, she is working on 2 monographs, the first of which is a memoir of the 1.5 generation, Not That Kind of Indian, and the second, a book on colonialism and design, deliberate designs, affect and aesthetics in post-colonial literature and culture. She is also writing 2 essays, Sonic Solidarities, Transcultural Lives of We Shall Overcome, In My Name is Khan, and Feral Citizenship and Gender in Bahanu Kapels. Oh, she teaches at Naropa. Girls Without Borders. You should read the book, according to Priya. In her spare time, she also likes to cook, read, be outdoors, and design and organize interior spaces. Priya. And right on my right, we have Jerry Mikulski. Jerry is a guide to trust. During the dozen years he helped shape the dot-com revolution as a tech industry trends analyst, Newsweek called him a software seer, he realized that the word consumer made him itch. Paying attention to the word gave him the thesis that we are entering a relationship economy. We are rediscovering trust, interdependence, and meaning through movements as varied as open source software, pattern, languages, and sharing economy, the sharing economy, microfinance, unschooling, traffic, calming, and workplace democracy. Trust is the connective thread. Independent since the last millennium, Mikulski has been publishing his brain online for almost as long. You can browse it at www.jerrysbrain.com. He earned an MBA from the Wharton School, where he stumbled into the mind-expanding ideas of Russ Ackoff, and a BA in economics from the University of California, Irvine. He was raised in Peru and Argentina and speaks fluent Spanish and German, as well as pretty passable French. So at this point, I want to open things up to the panelists and allow them to engage in some opening remarks.
What order would you like?
Why don't we work our way back this way? So you can go first.
Oh, so me first.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, it's delightful to be here and really delightful to be on a panel with this subject. I think there's few topics that are as important as this age-old topic. I just want to say 3 quick things by way of setup. First is my favorite saying about this issue, and it doesn't apply only to gender, but the privilege of privilege is not noticing the privilege, right? I don't cross the street to a different sidewalk because somebody walking toward me looks scary, et cetera, et cetera. You can walk through the different aspects of life where that sort of plays out. The second thing I'll say is that I grew up embarrassed for men. I grew up embarrassed kind of being a man, and it's a little weird because I grew up in South America. I was the son of an American executive. I had a pretty privileged childhood, and my dad was a man's man. Taught me how to shoot, swim, do carpentry, a series of things, and yet never a macho man. And so this embarrassment of being a man does not come from my dad somehow, strangely. He was awesome, like really, really, like never put any sorts of ideas about women that might have been derogatory in any way in my head. And so somehow I absorbed frat culture, whatever else it might be, and ended up thinking, like, what are guys doing? Why are we so stupid? And so that's the kind of the second thing I want to put in. And the third thing for the conversation is that I think that Me Too is a men's problem. Women are the victims mostly of this kind of abuse, and it's up to men to figure out how to stop other men from doing these sorts of things. How to do that maybe means learning to be a good ally in different ways, and among the things there, some of the bywords or ideas from being a good ally are, it's not all about you, and every now and then it actually is about you. So listening with care and figuring out how to be in that conversation. But I think that it's really up to men to pick up and figure out how to contact the rest of men so we stop doing these stupid things.
work on Bollywood, so I have this desire to burst into song and dance. Fortunately for you, I'm not going to do that. First of all, I really want to thank the CWA for organizing the whole thing, and this particular panel. I am humbled to be part of all these amazing people, and thank you all for coming. I've never seen so many people no, that's not true. When I was in grad school, we would have this. But anyway, I want to say a few things. One is, my work is on gender, sexuality, and nationalism. So much of where my thinking is and how I see the world is coming through that lens. And these are the courses that I teach as well, and my research is on that. So I want to put that out there, and particularly around histories of colonialisms in the world. So I draw from those histories to theorize, to talk about that. And I would say that while my training has been academic, and I, as you could hear,
closer to the mic.
Hello. Okay. While nobody's ever told me that my voice is soft. So, while my work, I've been trained to do academic writing, academic thinking, to move around in a certain kind of space. I would say that the feminism I espouse and the feminism I talk about with my students, with my friends, with my family, is maybe something that we might call vernacular feminism. I think the work that we do has to matter somehow. So I really insist on that in the work that I do. So I wanted to put that out there since I think I'm the only academic here. So there are a couple of points that I've been thinking about in relation to this topic. And one of them is around language. I work in literature and cultural studies. So, I'm very, very obsessed with language. And I'm hoping one of the conversations we will all have is around this notion of defining toxicity. Like, what does that mean for us? What is masculinity? And I think these are really interesting and problematic terms in many ways. Moreover, I said this at our lunch earlier today, but I really would like for us to start incorporating trans folks into this conversation.
What?
Trans folks.
Trans folks.
We have to. I don't think, we live in a world right now where we cannot afford to not bring them into these conversations. So I'm really hoping that's another direction in which we could go. So I want to say that also when we talk about masculinity, as a good postmodernist, I have to say I don't understand what that really means, and moreover, my work in ethnic studies and nationalism, when we're talking about white masculinities, it's very different from African American masculinities and very different from Asian masculinities or Asian American masculinities. So we need to complicate this dialogue further if we are going to keep moving forward, if we're going to open up these conversations. So that's something else I've been thinking about. And as well, can we talk about something called toxic masculinity as a global phenomenon, like the way that we encode this idea? Do you see what I'm saying? So if we're talking about toxic masculinity, kind of like feminism, right? We say feminism, and there's this idea that like women all over the world who are doing what we might call feminist deeds are, by virtue of that, feminists. So what is it, so this notion of toxic masculinity, which has become really part of our parlance. I hear this from my students almost every single day in classes. They will talk about it, they want to talk about it, which I think is exciting. But how does that travel across the world? Was that better? Was that clearer? So those are some of the thoughts in my mind around this idea. And I'll be quiet now.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm in awe of this conference. I always have been. How to logistically pull off 100 people coming from around the world for 5 days to do 200 panels, all for free. So I'm humbled to be here. I'm really grateful. And first, Jerry and Priya set me up perfectly because I really wanted to talk about fatherhood and then the semantics around this issue. I won't pretend to understand the nuance and I'm not well versed in all of the vernacular surrounding the issues, so a couple hours ago I Googled toxic masculinity, read a few pieces, watched a few videos, and it dawned on me, the definition of the word masculinity is just the qualities and traits we attribute to men. So it's not fixed. It's something that we can teach young boys that the commonly attributed characteristics of vigor or strength or ruggedness isn't, in my evaluation, toxic, but incomplete. If your bandwidth is so small that you define your masculinity or manhood by how tough and rugged you are and nothing else, I think that's when it can become toxic. But I don't see any of those attributes as inherently toxic. And I think that's important because sometimes I feel like the discussion around these issues can be intellectually lazy, and it can sometimes conflate someone who's genuinely a dangerous or bad person with someone who's unaware or as much a victim of a culture like football or like the military that can embody toxic masculinity as much as they are a perpetrator of the notion. So I'm hoping to learn today. We've got experts on the panel. I've got an open mind, and I'm interested in finding a way through and a way to redefine the term that isn't fixed. Thank you.
So just like Chris just said, I'm deeply honored to be here as well and to share in community with everybody, to share in community with all the panelists that are here. When I got the email about coming back, I was so happy. And then when I got the panel subjects and I saw this, I was like, oh, who did I make mad? I don't know about toxic masculinity. I've literally been described to the group of prisoners that I had the chance to lead inside of San Quentin and really think of as my team. When I was introduced to them, the guy who I took over for literally introduced me as like, this is Tulio Cardozo. He's so nice and so personable. You'd never imagine he knows how to code. And I was just like, oh man, I got to work on my geekiness. So that's probably where my intro came from. But I definitely feel that like I had to Google like what is toxic masculinity as well. And I realized like after taking some time to think about it that my experience having gone through the prison system has actually given me a really interesting perspective both as an inmate and a person that got to contribute meaningfully to the lives of others as people changed, in witnessing what it was to go through an environment that is just so supportive of being a man, that being able to not allow anybody to say certain words to you, supportive of empowering you to be entitled, empowering you to feel that it's good to stay this way and never consider something different. And it made me ask, why did somebody like myself go one direction, and why did somebody go an entirely different direction that, they've been there for the rest of their life? And having come back to prison, I've actually met a few people that I shared cells with, and they're unfortunately still there and haven't changed much of that. And in my thought process about this, what I've realized is that we've all been through things, whether or not we were small children. Like in my case, I got into prison because I was able to figure out that the root was from domestic violence with my mother in our household, and I didn't know how to cope with that, and I got into drugs as a social crutch, which ultimately ended up leading to a stay in prison. That was my coping mechanism, was doing the behaviors that got me into prison. And when I was there, I was very lucky to analyze myself and to figure out what it is in my belief patterns that got me there. But when I look at other people, I realize that many times the reason that they are in these positions where they're perpetuating toxic masculinity is because they don't have any other coping mechanisms that their community around them supports, or more importantly, they don't have any coping mechanisms that their community around them will tolerate to speak about. So I think, this is a really important subject to have here in a university campus, because although my experience had been through the prison system, I would hope that vicariously through my experience, we can talk about some of those conversations and some of those experiences, because there are many people that are here on this campus that have also been through certain things, that have also experienced things that have developed coping mechanisms that aren't necessarily the best way. And I would hope that in our conversations here, we could start to challenge what some of those assumptions are that we use on a day-to-day basis and really figure out how we can uphold and support it. I will just like to say that through the later part of my experience working in prison, I've had the honor of being able to work with many people who have been convicted of life sentences that have turned their life around and have been successfully reintegrated into society, and they're working, but more importantly, they're a positive person today, where if you met them 20 years ago, you would not want to walk on the same side of the street as them because they look physically very scary or emotionally very scary. And I've realized that what has transitioned them from being that person to who they are today is very much doing that self-development work. So in my belief and through my experiences, if we're going to support and discuss things that could help eliminate toxic masculinity, it would be to discuss how we can think about and potentially improve communities where just the whole subject of questioning our belief systems is the norm and is something that is accepted, and it's not I don't want to say taboo, but it's just not something that isn't supported. And I think that that's something that it's a lot deeper than it sounds, and it's something that we really need to think about. So that's kind of where my perspective is on this panel. And after I had a chance to Google it and meditate on it, I was actually really happy to be here with everybody, because I'm really excited to see how we can discuss some of these ideas together as a whole, with you included in community. So thank you.
So like everybody on the panel, I'm super stoked to be here with you all and be in conversation, because I do think that that's the key to the conversation. I'll start out with answering the question. The question is masculinity toxic? And I would say no, that it is not toxic. And I say that because the work of the Ms. Foundation is around shaping and challenging narrative, and what that looks like and what that means. And I think Chris hit it on the head, which is, the definition of the traits assigned to any one sex and in its terminology isn't in and of itself negative. So we actually hold dualities as individuals, right? Both masculine and feminine dualities. And in that vein, we actually need to get to a point, I believe, that actually allows us to embrace both sides of that. Mm-hmm. And in embracing both sides of that, it allows men to fully accept their masculine and feminine characteristics, embrace them and grow with them, and to accept that women can hold both characteristics also without being a critique. And it means we actually have to change the narrative around what these definitions look like and how they need to come to the center of conversation. And the work that we do at the Ms. Foundation is around gender equity, which is a recognition that we all need to be in this together in order to get towards the greatest level of people being their fullest self. As there will be no movement in this country or anywhere in the world that allows women to fully lead and be supportive until we have a conversation that allows for men to fully be themselves. And as a society, as the media, as politics, as all of those things go, we actually need to have a conversation. Right. So for me, this question, the idea that we are lifting up this conversation around masculinity and toxicity and what for me would be feminism and feminine behaviors also is about consciousness raising. And you touched on it, which I really appreciated. The women's movement started with people coming together and asking themselves questions and challenging the norm that had been put in front of them. And I believe that that is actually what we have to do, is create space for that to happen, and to play on also what Priya has talked about, which is to make space for the complexity of cultural competencies in having this conversation. And understand that it is going to take a long time for us to actually adopt and accept that. because it's based not just on a patriarchal society, not just on slavery in this country, right? Not just on colonialism. There are so many parts that are integrated into it. Let's not think it's a simple answer, or that there's a simple response, or that any one community, given economic dynamics, that we can get there in a day, a week, or even a year. And, you know, really appreciative of the conversation that Chris started out with, which is how do we change this behavior early on? Right. And how do we at least challenge this behavior internally, right? So it's happening with, what is the conversation we're not just having with our children and our children's friends, but how uncomfortable, how daring are we willing to be to have this conversation with our fathers and our grandfathers, and with our friends, right? To call out behaviors, don't be a baby, don't be a little boy, what aggressive behavior, quote unquote, looks like for men and for women, and what that looks like for women of color and men of color, actually gets changed in the conversation. So I'm really excited to be with this panel already, and I know this will be a wonderful conversation. So I open the door for questions, and I look forward to being in conversation without having the answers.
Yeah.
And I thank you all for being here today.
If any of the panel wants to respond to anyone's opening statements, feel free.
I think this is all important work. I'm in awe.
I think I may be able to triangulate a couple points between Jerry and Teresa. So Jerry, you talked about the Me Too being a men's issue and men taking ownership. I think a lot of times, I mentioned intellectual laziness or oversimplification, when that's backed with emotion. And I've heard I spent a lot of time on college campuses, and I hear plenty of young people who are well-intentioned but can sometimes be operating from a really emotionally charged place and throw around terms like toxic masculinity. And I think as a kid that grew up with modest means from the Rust Belt, and I know a lot of wonderful middle-aged white men, that would alienate. And so I'm wondering if there's a skillful way for people that want to make substantive progress to engage with those that may be apprehensive.
That's a really good question. Do you want to dive in?
So one of the interesting things that's coming up a lot in panels here already is how do we enter these conversations in a way that doesn't alienate the other, whatever the other is, right? And there's lots of others for each of us. And I think the people who are really good at dealing with the other are the bravest and greatest of us. And so even the term masculinity, never mind toxic, is probably an opening salvo that isn't that helpful. So how do you get behind it to the behaviors? How do you stop them when they're in motion? Or what do you do rather than stop them when they're in motion? How do you have a conversation later? And there was an article I was reading recently about how the Inuit raise their children, and they never raise their voice. They think that when you raise your voice with a child or with an adult, that's a terrible, stupid thing. So later they sit down and they act through stories, they tell stories, they do other kinds of things that lead to the kinds of considerations of self and other that might have led to a different behavior at the time. And they're just trying to grow the child into an adult. It's a great and sensible thing. But we have so many families where violence and screaming and whatever is just the norm, that, as Teresa said, we have layer after layer of things that kind of peel apart, carry off, break apart, and work through. And I'm puzzled. I love your openness to, we don't have the answers here. I'm puzzled as to how do we open these kinds of doors. My favorite tool for change is when somebody you trust takes you by the hand to try something new. To me, we each engage in that a couple times over, and we can change a lot of things in the world, because I will try something I've never thought of trying if somebody I like says, hey, we're doing this thing this weekend, will you join us? Right? So I think that's an open door, but there's many, many others.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I actually appreciate the way you set up the question, Chris, because I do think there's something to the complexity of how uncomfortable are you willing to be, which I think is a real question. Are you willing to have a conversation, which is another question? And in this fast-paced world that we are living in, will we take the time to do it? And I think that is key to all of this, which is, will we take the time? And if we take the time, we actually have to be in relationship to help people move through it. It's not just me sharing my experience and you sharing your experience, and then you should get to X, Y, or Z, right? But, so I do think we have to reframe the question. I think we talk in terms of academia, in ways of like, it needs to have this definition or that definition. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we be the fullest human we can be? And what does that look like? And don't we want that? What is the value conversation we want to have? Don't we want that? And I think there's something in there that can get us to some of this. I think we also, for me, there's also, what is this rite of passage that in this country has perpetuated a level of toxic masculinity that says, you know, if I can belittle a woman, if I can take you down, what is the conversation around power that we need to have in order to get there? Because I do think, you know, I did some work with the NFL, and part of the conversation that I had were really great men who really got it and really were very holistic about their approach. But they were pulled into, and Jerry, you mentioned this, right? They were pulled into a social abstract that talks about how we transition in manhood and how we need to dominate. And so until we have a conversation around power dynamics, what that looks like, it's hard to really go too deep and make assumptions. So I'm not making any assumptions. What I'm saying is there's a whole bunch that we actually, as women and as those who believe we are quote unquote woke, probably a decaf cup of coffee woke, not actually 3 cups of regular espresso woke, who actually need to do a self-analysis of how we perpetuate the conversation and the behaviors.
Yeah. I completely agree with you, and I want to just start off by saying that I'm taking you up on having conversation without the answers.
Okay.
All right, but I you know, having listened to what everybody's saying, I think one of the underlying root things that's going on here too is that deep down, like, there's a really deep desire to be understood and to be heard, and you know, I think that part of like what's going on in general is that our communication abilities as a society is not necessarily as well developed as we potentially should be, because when we decide that we're not being heard, or we decide that this particular way that you're trying doesn't work, that's when we start to revert back to the social norms that seem to work for others. So when you witness somebody getting power and stepping over somebody else and doing that, and it works for them, whether it's a man or a woman, you will inherently get sick and tired of getting stepped on yourself and pick those habits up, I think. So like, the way I look at the situation from what I'm hearing, and not having an answer necessarily, but I really think that, you know, mechanisms for, I'm trying to dance around it, but I should just say, like mechanisms for like nonviolent communication, which I think is a really great ideology, really great sets of programs out there, but I feel that the name is a terrible name from the perspective that it's really more like effective communication. I feel like nonviolent in the name of something like automatically says that you must be a violent person to benefit from this, or you typecast yourself into being a violent person, so like I don't want anything to do with that. And that's kind of like how I even took the first time I took a class in nonviolent communication. I thought to myself again, I'm like, nice guy, I'm like a tree-hugging hippie that likes computers. I don't need this. And right there, I was falling into that whole perpetual belief system that you don't need a new skill set. You don't need to question your own coping mechanisms. Like, your communication is just fine. But you know what? Like, it's like this guy in high school once told me. I remember telling him like, oh yeah, when a time I'm like 30, I'm gonna like drive a Ferrari and blah blah blah. And you know, I was dealing drugs. And he's like, dude, look at you. And I'm like, yeah, man. I mean, what's wrong? And he goes, dude, you sell drugs. You should be like, you should be paying attention to class. And I'm like, you know, it took me a minute to realize it. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess you got a point. But like, right over my head, you know. And the whole thing is like, with myself in that regard, I used a coping mechanism because I didn't know how to communicate all these other underlying issues. So, I mean, without an answer, I think like part of it too is that, yeah.
You know, I'm coming at it from a couple of different perspectives, and one of the points around being open and, you know, embracing that full self. And I think for a lot of people, you know, it's incredibly difficult. You know, I think about friends of mine whose parents perhaps are unwilling. You know, they see nothing. There's nothing I need to work on. There's nothing I need to do. This is just the way my life is. And the kinds of problems, I think the family is something that we should be talking about in relation to this. And so, I mean, the family as like in a microcosm, the nuclear family, but I'm also thinking like, I work on nation, right? The kind of, the family of the nation itself, and the different kinds of institutions and the systems that perpetuate these stereotypes. You know, and in all different ways. Yes, you know, I have friends who raise their boys to be feminists, and these kids are amazing. But yet they're also stepping outside the home. They're moving around in different social circles, right? So how do you mitigate those, you know, that factor? So I mean, I don't have children, so I don't deal with this stuff, and my dogs have no issues around any of this. But you know, so I think that's something else that's really important for us to kind of just throw into the mix. And I, you know, I agree with you. I think asking questions is a step. It's probably, to my mind, as somebody who teaches writing and who writes herself, I don't know, that figuring out what that question is going to be is probably the most important thing. You know, and I mean, I truly believe that. So thank you for bringing that up. So, you know, so this notion of the family, how does the family get impacted by all, you know, all of this? I think is something to consider. And again, you know, the kind of different kinds of cross-cultural ways in which we, you know, which we move around. So, yeah, really good, very thought-provoking.
Tulio became a father this year. He mentioned that to me Sunday at the dinner. So
I appreciate it. It's funny, actually, I had it in my notes here too to make sure to like outline that my perspective is as a father and as a person who's witnessed lots of.
if you're waiting to drop the news at CWA, I apologize.
No. Actually, you
Could I
did good. You
interject
did
for a
good. So-
second? Just really quickly. Also, how do we talk about all of these things using the lens of feminism? Really coming at it from a feminist point of view, especially when we have so many people who resist that idea. You know, they really fight it. So how do we do that? And you know, I go back. When I was thinking about this panel this morning, in my head went back to Gloria Steinem's op-ed in the Washington Post in 1973. Women's liberation aims to free men too. I don't know how many of you have read it, but if you haven't, you should. It's all over the internet, like everything else. And but you know, in it, she makes this argument. I mean, so long ago, she's making this argument, and I think it's just as relevant. And in some ways, you know, we need to go back and look at some of the questions that they were asking and how they might matter or how we need to rethink them for our time. So that was another thought I had, was like just around feminism, like framing everything around that.
Yeah, I want to open up a question from the audience. So a student was asking that they've noticed that fraternities seem to consistently perpetuate toxic masculinity or toxic masculine behavior. What should be done in the panel's opinions to address this problem?
I can answer. I can at least begin answering. At my university, there's a very robust Greek life because the students are very stranded. They don't really have any place to go, so their social lives are on campus. And we have, you know, the kind of traditional, typical fraternities, but we also have fraternities when I first came to my work, there was a fraternity called RYG, and they did all this work around male violence. They were really doing all these different programs around consent. I mean, this is back in 2005. So they were holding programs all over campus. Then we had this women's fraternity sorority with whom they partnered, and they were doing joint programs. But at my school, we have that. It's already being done, and people are excited and interested. But my school also has a very strong social justice background, and most of our students identify as liberal. So I think in some ways it's easy to have that there. But I wonder at what level, and I know at one point one of the fraternities had somebody who worked at some national Greek organization come in and train them and talk to them about these things. So perhaps that's one way of finding space. I mean, kind of like what you do, right?
Yeah, I think a football team's not exactly a fraternity, but it's similar. I think anytime you get 100 young men whose brains aren't done developing and they're binge drinking 4 times a week, bad news is going to happen.
Yeah.
So sometimes with some of these issues, I think, and this isn't excusing any of that behavior, there's a lot of abhorrent behavior in fraternities and on football teams, but sometimes I think we're addressing the limb and not the root of the problem. So if these men or young men are brought up with a wider bandwidth on the definition of masculinity, with tools to create space, with less taboo on underage drinking, and an acknowledgement of how to do it responsibly. There's a million different things that we can do. I'm not naive enough to think it would be a radical change overnight. I know frat culture's baked into the university system at places like Colorado. And it's also important to note and empathize that there's a lot of wonderful men that are in those situations. And like I mentioned earlier, maybe as much victims of that culture as perpetrators of it. So I think in short, we can head this issue off at the pass if we start with younger people.
So I think that's right. We have to start younger, but I also think that we have to actually start humanizing people. And we've created culture that just has perpetuated the dehumanization of anybody that is considered other. Be that women, be that the LGBT community, whomever it happens to be. And I will go back to something that Jerry said when he said #MeToo is a men's problem. I'm a big believer in that. Right? It's not about how well I train my son. It's actually a conversation about how men talk to other men and how they hold each other accountable. Not because it's your wife, it's your daughter, it's your sister, it's your best friend, but because that person is a human and they deserve to be treated with respect. And where masculinity becomes toxic is when we dehumanize people. And so we have to go back into that conversation that pushes that forward. And as a society, there is an unconscious bias and a conscious bias around what that looks like. And so we have to actually participate, I think, far more aptly in witness awareness programs, right, that teach people how to step in, how to intervene. We need to have real conversations around what we value and what are the behaviors that reflect that value and reflect who we are. And men need to be able to be given the terminology and the language that helps them reach an expression that doesn't alienate them. And we need to recognize that particularly in college, people want to fit in. And what does fit in look like, and how can you change what fit in looks like? I think those are just some things I would put out there. And part of it is saying we're not going to stand for it. And if that means you take apart the Greek system and realign it on both sides, and realign it, I think that could happen. I think there's also something that Chris said. We actually have to have a conversation also about underdeveloped brains and sexuality and body positiveness. And, I mean, there's a whole conversation that has to be happening on all sides in order for us to really change the culture.
Maybe everybody in the Greek system should have to learn to read and speak Greek and read the Lysistrata.
In the original.
You can, find, you can find that on jerry'sbrain.com.
Yeah, it's actually true.
Yeah, it's actually true. You can find that on jerry'sbrain.com. 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 You can find
It's under sex strikes.
So I just want to add to, like, I completely agree with needing to learn and read and write and speak. No, I'm just kidding. But I really do think like humanizing people and like the root of the cause of like, why are people even joining the Greek system? Like, what is it that they're seeking? And I think that there is belonging, there's family, there's goal setting, right? I think like as coming to, you know, I fortunately never had a chance to go to a prestigious university like this unless I've been invited to panel at one, although I've definitely had those goals. But I visioned, you know, wanting to get into a sorority or something like that. And the point I'm getting at is I think that like within the context of the question, maybe also thinking about what are like the right goals that we can support for people that are inside of the college system in general, so that if they're entering some kind of the Greek system, like can we have that, I don't know if it's so much of a conversation or if it's so much of a goal where, you know, we know that there's going to be drinking, we know there's going to be certain things because it's just part of growing up and learning how to deal with life, but like establishing goals as a society in here that we're all supporting and working towards, because I think having positive goals is something that you can take every single day and feel like you're moving and progressing forward in a good way, and some of those goals can be like effective communication, humanizing each other instead of making each other drink until you look like a blob, those kinds of things, you know. And I just want to agree, I both, and like maybe make things more hard, you know, but I don't know if like coming in here and like the goal is to get your education and to get, you know, into one of these types of situations is like enough, or if like we need to start setting expectations at an earlier life, where there should be more goals that are concrete, because I think when you start making those earlier, you can actually create decisions in your life that are more specifically focused towards that, and potentially they can start again bringing these right questions up in all of your minds as you're going through the educational system sooner. And I think that applies not just to younger people, but to maybe people my age that finally decide to come back to a campus like this.
And perhaps also reimagine friendship and brotherhood.
Yeah.
That would have to be part of this
So
conversation.
I wanted to add one sort of serious note to this particular question, which is that, and picking up a bit on what Teresa said earlier, is that we're missing rites of passage. Like young people used to be brought into adulthood by adults. And whether that meant going out into the wilderness and surviving for 3 days and having a vision or whatever it meant, but different societies had rites of passage. And when you break the rites of passage, every child needs to feel like an adult, which normally means doing something sort of dangerous. I mean, you know, there's kind of aspects to rites of passage, right? So you take up smoking to look like an adult. You join a gang. Fraternities are, in fact, organized to try to bring you into adulthood, and some of their hazing rituals are meant to do that, to make you also bond with a club and feel like a member of a thing, and all the things that good rites of passage actually do for societies. So part of the problem here is that we've dropped the ball entirely on bringing young people up into society and introducing them to how to be a mensch and how to be other people as humans. We've just blown that. We broke all of the institutions that used to do that, and we don't take it seriously. So I think that's something all of us could do, and we would create more humans who see other people as humans instead of more cults or sects or sections that see others as other with a capital O, because that's what this sect does, right? I love, there's a cartoon I saw recently that has a big tree, a tree diagram of the history of all sorts of sects, religious sects, and at the bottom is one, and it's like, we're right here, and like, thank God we solved the problem and got it right. It's like, really?
Another question we have is, in regards to characteristics that are feminine and or masculine, do these labels and therein categorization of traits help or hinder the way we look at masculinity? Should we get rid of the dichotomy in general, or is it vital for identity?
I'm sorry, could you read that again?
So in regards to characteristics that are feminine and or masculine, do these labels and therein categorization of traits help or hinder the way we look at masculinity? Should we get rid of this dichotomy in general, or is it vital for identity? Couple questions in there. Feel free to break
get
down
rid of
whatever
it
piece you
completely.
like.
Break the binary. I mean, it would be really great if
Yeah.
we could break out of the binary and go into, and you know, historically and culturally, and I'll turn this back over to Priya, who probably has much more history on it. These were not things that were identified to, these traits were not necessarily identified to anyone until they needed to be. Right? And so, you know, taking a look at what we do when we break those binaries apart allows us to really redefine what they could be.
Let me give an example. Has anyone heard of Hinderas? Do you know about Hinderas? That would be a good example right now, I think. So Hinderas are a group in India. And way back when, they were hermaphrodites, like true hermaphrodites, and that was the place where they stayed. You know, they worked in temples. They were, they had a very religious role to play in Hinduism. And as time went on, as the number of hermaphrodites, they wore saris. They looked like women. They completely adopted that mode of being. And then later on, it became a place for gay men to find a safe space, this particular community. So in a country that up until recently, you know, where homosexuality was illegal, it gave gay men a home as well. And so, you know, they work primarily within temples and also as prostitutes. It's a group where straight men will have sex with Hinderas, but it's not considered gay sex. They're women, sort of, right? And I mean, in the Indian parliament, there are actually seats that are reserved for Hinderas. Haha, can you imagine that here? You know, that backwards country. And so, you know, and I think of that as an example of this sort of blurring, you know, or not even blurring, but like really kind of folding in different aspects of what people can be. And, you know, to me, that's been powerful. I grew up in India, so, you know, I used to see Hinduras all the time, and, you know, they kind of scared me a little bit because I didn't understand. And then when I got older and I started doing some research, so I think they're a fascinating group. And there are groups like that all over the world. You know, I mean, India isn't alone in it. And so I think, you know, I think this collapsing of these, I see these boundaries, the dichotomous boundaries, you know, like, am I this or am I this? They're fiction. They don't hold water. You know, we're much more complicated beings than any category that we could be placed in. And I think that's it's an important step for all of us to take, and it's an incredibly difficult step for us to take in many ways. You know, that would be embracing particular kinds of stereotypes that we put upon the other gender, right? And, oh, I'm not that, or I'm not this. You know, like when my mother used to tell me, don't laugh out loud. Ladies don't do that. Or cross your legs when you're sitting down. She still tells me all this. I bray like a donkey. And so, but you know, but these are sort of the things that we have to work within. And again, I always come back to institutions. I work in cultural studies. I'm always thinking about institutions. And I think about, I don't know if you've read Neera Yuval Davis. So Neera Yuval Davis, who is a political scientist, she wrote this awesome book called Gender Nation. And what she does in the book, that's apropos what we're talking about, is she lists these different categories. Women are, men are. You know, so women belong in nature, where men belong in culture, blah, 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 you know. And she talks about how we just have symbolic power. Our power isn't real. And I think that's something that we have to kind of, you know, my dissertation was on this.
We'll talk later.
We'll talk later. And so, you know, and she says, men are always seen to be contiguous with history, right? When we go out in public spaces, we see male statues, we see men celebrated, but we're not seeing women. I mean, that's changing, and I'm so happy to see that changing. And so I have been working within this framework for quite a long time and trying to think through it. But I think this gets back to those stereotypes. Like, you know, what is it? My husband cries all the time. All the time. We got married, he was crying, I was handing him tissues. I don't cry. You know, what does that mean? You know, and so, you know, so I think these are the very, and it's great because the fact that he can emote, he was an actor, so he can emote really helps us a lot, both of us and him. You know, so I think these are the very kinds of things, like how do we make some of these things, some of these categories, some of these things that we're supposed to feel or not feel, part of what everybody feels. You know, we are all human, and we're complicated.
I think if we want to break down any of this, we can do it. I mean, there is no greater time than now to start putting out the question and challenging the language that we use.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I appreciate who asked the question because you know, the reality is, so let's do it. Let's take apart a conversation around masculinity and talk about what is toxicity, which is something that is bad for the body. So the body in and of itself would be the entity of society. Then how do you want to break that down?
Right.
And what does that look like? Because bullying happens all over the place, right? Negative energy happens in a lot of spaces. And so I think this is the time when you could start posting the question, asking the question, coming up with alternative language. If anything in the social justice space that I've been in the past 5 years is that every day there's a new word or new term that makes for a definition that we're trying to reconstruct or deconstruct.
So weirdly, we've gotten this far along this panel and we haven't mentioned the predator in chief, who has in a very weird way opened up a space for this conversation.
Yep.
I really hate to say it, but he's kind of cracked open some norms. You've heard of Overton's window, sort of what's acceptable to do, and it gets opened. He's shredded Overton's window on public discourse, things that would never have been said on the air are being said on the air because we're just quoting the president, right? So that has created the kind of moment that Teresa's talking about. But I want to offer you a mental model that I don't know, I thought of it years ago. This is only my model. You may like it, you may not, but I'm going to borrow yin and yang from Taoism, with apologies to Taoism. And in Taoism, yin, bless you, in Taoism, yin is generally receptive, feminine, dark, earth energy, and yang is outward, bright, active energy. And it's not that all men are yang and all women are yin, it's that any entity, whether it's a person, a family, a culture, to be healthy needs to have yin and yang and creative tension. And the interesting things happen in that kind of tension. And then the thing that I came to believe, and this is again just me, is that somewhere between 300 and 3,000 years ago, yang won. And yang decided to demonize yin. And yang said, everything yin you can ignore, we actually need to actively stamp out. So all of women's traditional wisdom, stamp it out. And I also overload yin and yang. So to me, yang is also analytic, hierarchical, paternalistic, command and control, all those kinds of things. And yin is emergent, social, emotional, meaning, purpose, love, all those kinds of things. And a healthy entity needs both. You don't want a world run by either or. But this is my background for looking at the sort of layers of institutional crap that we're lying inside of, because each of those was sort of designed by men for efficiency, scale, and profit. And so I love institutional design. I think it's really essential here. And we're stuck inside of a series of institutions that no longer trust us as individuals. So my whole thing is trust. And I figured out that we're living inside of a world of institutions designed for mistrust, partly because we handed the world over mostly to white men eventually to design, build us a compulsory education system or a punitive judicial system and penal system. And if you look around the world, there are far better ways of resolving all of these problems. Lots of other cultures have done this better, mostly cultures that are in touch with this balance between yin and yang for me, that's just the model that works for me.
So unfortunately, we are up on time. I want to thank the panel for their participation.